Hi, folks, and thanks, Kimberley. It's just ticked one past the hour on my watch, and as Kimberley mentioned, we're still waiting probably for a number of people to turn up. So we'll wait one more minute and we'll officially get started. Might just do a quick sound check. If anyone can hear me, maybe just use one of the responses. Yep, good. Thank you very much. Folks, I think we'll get started. It's 2 past the hour. I know there's a lot of people that had registered, and I think people will trickle in as we go. So hello and welcome, and thank you very much for joining us for the inaugural Rural Research Collaborative Learning Network, so RR-CLaN Research Education and Training Calendar. My name is Dr. Alex Stevens. I'm the Director of Research at Northern New South Wales Local Health Districts, and I belong to one of the member organisations of RR-CLaN. So just by way of background, RR-CLaN is the coming together of like-minded individuals from similar organisations who, through collaboration, have established a network for research with the view of providing learning, training and education opportunities, the possibility of future collaborative research. The first initiative of RR-CLaN is the establishment of the Research Education and Training Calendar. I want to make special mention of Dr. Zoe Michaelif, the Research Operations Manager in my research office, who has been instrumental in leading the development and establishment of RR-CLaN. Zoe may be joining us today, and if she is, will hopefully be doing so from the comfort of her own home as she's about to bring new life into the world. I also want to thank representatives from member organisations for their effort, enthusiasm and commitment for making today a reality. Today's seminar, How to Do a Literature Review, is brought to you by Illawarra Shoalhaven Local Health District and will be presented by Dr. Kimberley Davis, Senior Research Clinician at Illawarra Shoalhaven Research Operations Team. Kimberley, next slide, please.
Oh, there we go.
So I want to officially get us started by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands and waters where we work and live. We acknowledge the traditional custodians' living culture, their connection to country, and their contribution to the life of this region. We pay our respects to the ancestors and elders of the region and to all Aboriginal peoples past, present, future, and any Aboriginal people who may be joining us today. Welcome. Next slide, please, Kimberley. Just a little bit of housekeeping. So given the large attendance, we've decided to mute all of your microphones, but please feel free to ask questions throughout the seminar, and you can do so using the chat function, and we will try our best to answer them. Next slide. A bit more housekeeping. So as I mentioned, your microphones are muted, so you don't have to worry about that. The session is being recorded for viewing at a later date. So if you don't want to appear in the recording, please turn off your microphones. Next slide, please, Kimberley. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Kimberley Davis. So Kimberley completed her PhD in 2015 at the University of Wollongong School of Chemistry. Although a chemist by background, Kimberley was able to branch out into the biomolecular sphere, investigating the molecular mechanisms of tumour immortality. Since then, Kimberley has worked in a diverse range of areas, including science communication, academic teaching, lab-based work, and also community engagement. Kimberley is engaged heavily in the academic teaching space at University of Wollongong, coordinating subjects and developing content, and that motivated her to enrol in a graduate certificate in tertiary teaching and learning practices, which she completed in mid-2020. Kimberley is now in the clinical research sphere as part of the research operations team at Illawarra Shoalhaven LHD, joining in mid-2020. Kimberley has published with Illawarra Shoalhaven LHD clinicians in both general and orthopaedic surgery, aged care and rehabilitation, and has several more papers currently under review or in preparation, and is involved in a number of exciting ongoing projects across the spectrum of clinical areas. Kimberley was successful late last year in receiving a Cancer Institute New South Wales Clinical Variations Grant, along with Dr. Stephen Craig, an Illawarra Shoalhaven LHD surgeon. Now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Kimberley, who will guide you through today's presentation. Thank you very much, Kimberley.
Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone for joining. It's just so wonderful to see so many people here and from such a wide geographical area. So I hope what I have to say today will be helpful in some ways. I appreciate with such a large number of people, we're going to have a large variation in people's research background and expertise. So obviously today you're not going to come out being the world expert on how to do a literature review, but what we want is for you to have understood the concept of a literature review, what it's about, why you should do one, and also have a few key tips and tricks for getting yourself started. So this is me. Alex has given a lovely introduction. May or may not have written that myself. And so we'll get started. Now, what is a literature review? So you've all come to this session to do a literature review, but I want to know what you guys actually think a literature review is. What words would you associate with it? There might be technical words like library and research and journals and manuscripts and all this sort of stuff. Or it could just be, please help. That could be the word that you think when we say literature review. So Alex, if you could launch the first poll for us, this should appear on your screen soon. We're going to do a word cloud. For those who haven't done a word cloud, it's a bit of fun and it has some different words as everyone starts to type things in. Let's see if we can get this going.
Sorry, one moment. I'm just launching a word cloud now.
Thank you. So I'm going to have 30 seconds or so when this pops up. There we go. Put in what word describes your current mood? Hang on. Let's cancel that one.
First glitch.
I'm going to try it. Maybe I can only do it because I set it up.
I think
Clearly, guys, we know what we're doing. Hey, there we go. Too much technology. So pop in the words that first come into your head when you think of someone's already gone for help. Excellent. I'm glad you're here. All right. Pop in a word. What's the first word that comes into your mind when you think of literature review? So we've got evidence coming up. So the size of the word for you, if you haven't done word clouds, the size of the word is how many people say this word. So we've got scary and help. I'm really glad you're here today. Overview, search engine, search of an article. Someone says lots of reading. Yes, but we're going to work out how we can effectively do that. Journal articles, overview, latest or current evidence. But the word evidence is definitely popping up quite strongly. And I think that's a really important key point as well, because it is evidence. We're looking for the evidence base in this particular area. It's all very well when you go off and do research, and that's now the biggest word here. It's all very well when you go off to do research to just make something up because you think it sounds good. We want to look for that evidence base. And that's going to come out of things here. So paper, journal articles, journal, research evidence, subject evidence. This is where you get that information. This is really cool. 324 people have responded. That's wonderful. But I think, again, really key, so review of evidence, evidence summaries, subject evidence. You're starting to get a theme for what it is. And then a few people found it scary as well. All right, I might pop that down now and we'll keep going. So thank you everyone for your responses. So what is a literature review? Well, firstly, it's a tool to evaluate the knowledge in a particular area. So this is what you guys have already said in that word cloud. It's what is already known, what is currently accepted. And again, this is something as clinicians you probably already know or have a good sense of, but you want to have the evidence, that keyword again, the evidence for what is currently accepted. You'll also be able to find out emerging evidence or current trends, what's currently known, and that might be different to what it was 20, 10, even 5 years ago. The other key thing that you're going to find out is what is not known. So often in manuscripts, people will report the evidence that they found, but they'll also report on the things that weren't clear, what they don't know, what future work should do. So that's what it can do for you. Now, when we say literature, what does literature mean? We're not talking about like your HSC English literature kind of stuff. In scientific or research terms, we're talking about published material, so books, academic journals, and the like, stuff you can get from your library. It can also include, and quite legitimately include, government reports, conference proceedings, there might be professional handbooks, electronic databases. It's appropriate to use some of those in the right context. To give you an example of some government reports and online content that's super useful if you're doing a literature search, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. I've often gone to them and put some of their works in my manuscripts because they have national broad reporting on a huge range of areas. So if you want to contextualize, say, the prevalence of a particular disease that you're looking at, this is a really great starting place because you can get some of those figures on a national level. These are all online, they're government reports, but you could actually include that as literature, even though you won't necessarily find it at your local library or your hospital library. Now, a good review takes time, but is also worth the time. So you might sit there and think, oh my goodness, this is taking forever, but it's absolutely worth it. There's no point in going ahead and doing all this research if you don't have the background and you might be repeating something that people already know or just going down a wrong path. We don't want to be doing that. So if someone says to you, oh, look, we want to do this thing, look, you should go and review the literature in the field. Okay, what does that actually mean? Someone tells you to do that, your manager or someone like that. What the heck does it mean? So it's evaluation and synthesis of sources to gain a broad view. So I mentioned this earlier. It helps you understand where your research fits in this area. And it also helps frame your research question. You don't want it to just be something you pulled out of your brain. Looking up some literature on literature reviews, one reference said, compare, contrast, synthesize, and make arguments. And I think there's some really key points in the taxonomy. We're not just regurgitating stuff that you find in an article. You're comparing, you're contrasting, you're synthesizing information, you're putting it together and understanding it and making those arguments. So it's a synthesis of a range of sources. You can place your own argument in the context of others and in position or relative to the existing literature. You can make it connections, but it's also a critical evaluation. What it isn't is just a whole collection of texts that you think are really interesting or relevant. It's not going to be a descriptive summary of everything. It's not a list of everything. And it's not just, oh, I think this might be vaguely relevant, so I'll chuck it in anyway. Compare, contrast, synthesize, make arguments. So you're not just compiling a list, you're trying to pull the information out. So it can also be quite an iterative process. So for example, you might start with your library resources, do a bit of a search, quite broadly perhaps, and then you're going to start refining it. So you'll use, for instance, Boolean operators, and we'll have a look at that later. You then review and refine. Oh, okay, this maybe is some literature in the particular area that looks really relevant. That may also trigger you to think about, oh, here's some other things or maybe other keywords that I didn't think about that are really relevant. Here's some other papers, and there's some great references in that paper as well. You then start to refine and create your own list of keywords and synonyms, and then you might start the process again with that refined list of keywords or search terms. It's always very iterative, and you never just do one literature review and say, oh, well, that's it. Especially if you're ongoing in a particular clinical area, it's an ongoing process. Now, where can you get literature? I keep talking about the library, and that's probably the main place you're going to get it. So a primary source would be original research in peer-reviewed journals. A lot of that is online these days. You can get it through Google. Some of it is paywalled, so you might have to go through your local institutional library, whether that's the health district or if you're associated with a tertiary institution, your institutional account will get you through that paywall. There's also secondary sources. So sometimes people do reviews and analyses and they summarize research. I actually really like these, especially if you're starting off, because they create a great synthesis of that information for you, and it's a great launch pad too. And then you can get some tertiary sources, which are compilations of the above. Where can you find them? Well, there's a range of databases. You've probably heard of some of these: PubMed, Web of Science, etc., etc. They're a central point for accessing a range of journals, but they can be linked to particular publishing houses. So do be careful of that. So I think from memories at ProCrystal Scopus is associated with Elsevier. So some journals may not be indexed in those. Personally, I like to use our library discovery search because it actually pulls from all the different databases. So you're not going to miss something just because it happens to be published in a particular journal that isn't associated with that publishing house. That's just my preference, but there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do it. And as I mentioned, often there's a paywall if something's not open access, but you can usually get access through your institutional login. So you got a database, you want to do some searching. How many is a good number? You know, and if you have two less, as per the comic, people think you're making it up. If you got too many, people think you've just regurgitated everything you've found. Now, be aware that if you come up with a lot of search results, maybe that's because there's a lot of literature, or it could be just the way you've searched. Of course, the converse is true. If you only have 5 references, maybe you're searching too narrow and you need to think about how you're doing that. So these are the Boolean operators that I mentioned earlier. Back in the deep dark days of the very early intranet, kids, this is how we had to search Google. Of course, Google's pretty smart these days, and we don't necessarily have to do that. But these are some common ones that are really useful to know. So using the asterisks, that's if you don't want to restrict or miss things where there might be different spellings or different suffixes. So if you're in a respiratory area, for example, respiratory, respiration, respirator, just something with the root of that word. You can also have wildcard characters, so American versus UK spelling. Very, very useful. You don't want to all of a sudden not get a whole bunch of literature. And there's some orders of operations. So for instance, you might want to search child or adolescent, meaning it's going to search child asthma and adolescent asthma. The big one is also putting it in inverted commas. So if you put something, just the words, it searches childhood and asthma and all the words that you put in. And then you can use and or not, which combines, has at least one, and excludes. So if there's something that keeps coming up and you're like, oh, for goodness sakes, I don't want to see that, you can put not and then whatever the keyword is that keeps bringing it up. So keep that in mind as well. A discussion point, maybe people want to put something in the chat. This is also a chance for me to have a drink of my tea. Why do you think using Boolean operators could be important? And why could you miss? Well, what could you miss as well? So I'll have a sip of my tea. Pop it in the chat. Why do you think Boolean operators could be important, and what could you be missing?
While people are thinking and you're having a sip of your tea, Kimberley, there's one question here around your preferred search vehicle again. What was that?
I actually use our library database. When we log into our ISLA library, there's this thing called Discovery Search, which casts a broader net across a range of databases. And I'm going to give the unkosher response, which is I often chuck stuff into Google as a starting point. I know that's terrible and I shouldn't say it, but it's actually a really good starting point if you sit there and go, well, I don't know what to do. The other reason that you want to do that, and my caveat to it is please don't just use Google, make sure you're using your databases. But the other thing is it can also help you find those government reports or maybe industry handbooks and all that sort of stuff as well. So if you're using the right search terms, you can find some useful resources as well. So we're getting a whole bunch of responses in here. Someone said they didn't know about them and it's explained why they're having issues. So I'm really glad you've learnt something. Molly says it narrows the search and weeds out the wrong articles. I think that's really good. So she's also hit the nail on the head here that you can actually have it too narrow. So just be careful of that, but it does help you refine it as well. People have said refining a few times saves time and filters, refines. There we go. Same. Google Scholar okay to use. Look, I'm not going to say no. look, I've just said I use Google. Just be aware when you're using Google Scholar, and I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here, that it will pick up anything that's on the internet. So I have a major personal issue with people using preprint servers. So sometimes if people are publishing, they'll pop an article up on preprint servers. What it means is that it's up there, but it hasn't been peer reviewed. So this is the key thing. Peer review means someone has critically looked at it, assessed it, and evaluated it for its scientific merit and validity and soundness. Anyone can put something on a preprint server. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is that Google Scholar will pick those up. So just be careful if you're using it that you look at the journal that it's coming from, because there's some common preprint servers. So it's like, what is it? Research Square. There's the MedRx something that I can't remember, and the same with the Bio one, and there's a few others. So if something's coming up on Google Scholar and it's got some of those, I wouldn't use it in your literature because it's not been peer reviewed. So just be aware if you're doing Google Scholar and things like that. Someone who has said using not is dangerous and they don't recommend. Again, I think that's a good point. If you're getting something that you know is being triggered by your search term and you don't want it, it's useful. But again, I think Francis has a point that you can accidentally omit things that you don't want to as well. There's a lot of jargon and that sort of thing. So I think you guys are kind of onto it as well. And the last question, I'll move on after this. How do you know which journals are peer reviewed? So if you go through, if you have an article and you're like, has it been peer reviewed? If you go through to the journal or that article, it usually tells you like when it was accepted, reviewed, maybe a revision received. So if you see those sorts of steps, you know that it's been through a peer review process. Some are actually really obvious and they tell you that it was a double-blind peer review or something as well. And again, oh, Zoe's here. Hello, Zoe. And she makes a point that, yeah, Google does pull up articles that may not be peer reviewed. Alice, have I ever used AI? No, I haven't, but I have started using ChatGPT, which I will talk about later. So I'll get on to that. Thank you, everyone, for your responses. Let's keep going. I'm just going to have a really quick go if I can navigate the 5 million things. There we go. Now, hopefully, I've successfully dragged my web window. Can someone just pop in the chat, or maybe Alex, tell me you can see my web window?
Yes.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Clear.
So this is what I was talking about with the discovery search. Your institutional page will look something different. Let's do a couple of examples and I'll show you what I mean, but I think you're all across it. I'm going to talk about childhood asthma. Let's say you're in respiratory, you want to do something to do with childhood asthma. So if I just go childhood asthma and I go, I want to find things about childhood asthma, and you do that, and then you go, I've got like 800,000 results. It's not good. Or is great sometimes for casting a net wider, but in this instance, it's not, because now I've got 2 million, and at this point, you're just going to want to cry. So you then might go, oh, well, man, I really want to refine this. So I want to find something that's not just childhood and not just asthma, but it's childhood and asthma all in one. So now I've narrowed it down to 86,000 results. So that's good, but it's also, you know, it is still quite broad. My favorite way of something, if there's a really specific term that you want, is putting it in the inverted commas. So now we're starting to really narrow it down. Obviously, though, there's a heck of a lot of results here, and you're never going to be able to do absolutely everything. You might then think, okay, well, childhood asthma, that's probably actually a fairly generic term, but the brief I was given was actually to do with people who are exposed to secondary smoking. So this is where you can start putting them all together, and you might go, all right, I definitely want to find something about childhood asthma and, can't spell, and secondary smoking. That might be your specific area. Now it's starting to get more manageable, isn't it? You're down to 1,000. Now that's still a lot, and you're not going to read through them all, but this is just a really quick example of how these search operators can be really useful. So as you start filtering through, you'll get an idea of what useful terms you might want to put together, and you can use things like your and or that you can start to add as your searches as well. Alrighty. There we go. Now, this has already come up before, like the credible Hulk. We want to know that it's reliable. We've already talked about preprint. There's nothing like bad about them, but you really just have to be aware that they haven't been peer reviewed. So again, think about if it comes from a reputable institution, reputable journal that's indexed in one of the major databases, publisher, all that sort of stuff. And again, reputation and expertise of the author. There is a shall we say, wide variety of quality in the literature. As clinicians in a particular field, you're probably going to have a gut instinct of if something feels a bit odd. If it's directly opposing all the other literature, I'd probably think twice about it. Again, relevance to the topic area. If someone just makes a cursory side comment about the area you're interested in, but actually the focus of the paper is something else, I wouldn't really rely too much on that. The quality of writing and referencing is also a big kind of red flag. If there's stuff that they've just got a lot of dodgy typos and the writing is really poor and the referencing is just really odd, again, I'd sort of think twice about it. And obviously funding and conflicts of interest are really big. Every time someone publishes, you do have to declare your conflicts of interest. I'm not saying that every time, if there's, say, commercially funded research that gets published, I'm not saying it's bad. Some of it's actually really, really good. And we do need those big funding resources, shall we say, to help with some research. But I guess just keep that in mind. I'm not saying it's terrible, just keep it in mind. So something that often comes up is, can I use a website? So like kids in school these days, cite Wikipedia is like the worst thing that you could ever do. We all know that. But that's not saying that all the internet is bad. I think we went through a phase when the internet became a thing that we said, oh, you can't cite the internet. Well, it's not so bad. I talked about this earlier. There's online reports. ARHW has all those wonderful reports on pretty much every disease state or clinical area you could think of. Government, industry bodies, even say your own peak bodies for your clinical areas. They'd have some really great resources or protocols or handbooks, or it's online. There's nothing wrong with it. You can cite online reports. That's quite fine. Be very careful about opinion pieces, personal websites, that sort of stuff. I think this goes without saying, but I'm saying it anyway. Obviously, there may be some very specific circumstances you want to reference it, but just be really careful about it. Now, here's another one. If a paper is highly cited or in a high impact journal, does that automatically make it reliable? So you come across this paper that's been cited by 300 people and you go, oh my goodness, this must be the best thing ever. Well, maybe, but maybe not. I want you to think on these points. If it's been recently published, then obviously it takes time for citations to accumulate. So if it's a publication from last year, well, people haven't had time to read it, to cite it for their publications to appear in the literature. So it's still worth a look. There can be great publications or journals, but they're in really niche areas. So they're just not going to get the amount of citations. A classic example is the Burns Journal. That is a very specific area. So maybe the citations for some of those publications are smaller, but it could be something that's really, really specific. If you're working in a Burns area, for example, that's actually maybe a great journal that you want to go to, but it's not going to have 300 citations, maybe just because there's probably not as many people working in that area as, say, some genomic kind of cancer work. So the answer is yes and no, both at the same time, I think. Do be careful about a high number of self-citations or citations from the same country or institution. Again, that's a bit of a red flag. People like to make their own work look better or just work with all their mates. Nothing necessarily wrong with it, but again, it's just something to think about. And again, I've said this a few times. If you're in doubt, go with your gut. You guys are usually clinicians or you're experts in your field. Even if you're not a researcher as such, you'll probably have a fairly good feel for it. Now, do beware the predatory journal. This article popped up last year and it was a bit of an issue for a while. So Scopus is one of those databases, and there was a few journals that they stopped indexing. So what some journals like to do is they just want people to apply to them, and so they'll just start spamming everyone and say, oh, we're doing a special issue, can you just come and give us your articles? And they may or may not have great peer review process. It was hilarious because my PhD supervisor used to get a lot of emails addressed to me to his email because it was just a bot that was picking up his email, even though I was first author on it as well. So I'm not saying open access is bad. There's plenty of open access and it's becoming more and more common. Sometimes open access is great, but just be aware some journals actually charge a fee to even have it reviewed. And there's a bit of a some people feel like there's a bit of a culture of paying for your publications. So again, go with your gut, but if you're in doubt, just check some of the journals, what's the word, processes for getting published. And if you see that sort of thing, I'd probably steer clear. We're probably going to run out of time, but maybe in the chat, if you've had that experience with a predatory journal or something, just pop it in the chat, and it'd be really interesting for other people to hear what's happened. So with some of these, yeah, editorial scrutiny is not always as good. And again, check alignment with those reputable publishing houses. Editors, can you contact them easily? It's like, trying to help maybe an older relative with like the internet. Can I buy from this website? Am I going to get scammed? One of the big things is, can you actually contact the website? Think about the same for a journal as well. If you can't, I reckon it's spam. And again, checking the review process, timelines, fees for submission. There's nothing wrong with fees for publication if you get accepted. The fee for submitting, I just think that's super dodgy. Now, I think Alice brought this up later. If you've been living under a rock, you won't have heard of ChatGPT. Schools going back this term, all the New South Wales public schools have banned ChatGPT, and independent schools are free to do what they want. So far, they've said, oh, we're sure that teachers can tell the difference. That's rubbish, because according to Nature, which came out a couple of weeks ago, even researchers can't tell the difference between AI-generated and original abstracts. I don't have any wisdom here. This is really new, but I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I've used ChatGPT, just for a bit of fun as well, but I also was doing some coding with my data and was getting an error. And so I threw my error in and it gave me great answers on how I could fix it. So it's great. It's going to be used a lot more. And I think this is something that we're going to be hearing a lot more about. Because it can actually synthesize information really well. It's not just a glorified Google. It actually does that. So I don't have any wisdom. I just want to point it out. I think it'll be something we're going to be hearing more about. Now, I've talked a lot about finding the references, but what do you do with them? It's really, really easy to all of a sudden have saved 100 PDFs and then go, oh, help, what do I actually do with these? I cannot emphasize enough. Software to curate your reference list is absolutely vital. You will be in a corner crying if you don't have some of that. There's a few options. So Mendeley is one that I use. EndNote requires a license where Mendeley doesn't. Mendeley is free. If you are associated in particular with a university, often they will have, as part of your institutional login, you can access EndNote. If you can't do it, go for something like Mendeley. What they do is they have Microsoft Word plugins, so you can do your in-text referencing and citing when you're writing something. It saves you having to go and refiddle with it, and especially if you have to do a numbered reference list, it will reorder the numbers for you as you go. Amazing. Will save you your sanity. The other good thing is when you start to have build your own database in your clinical area, you go, oh my gosh, I had that paper that I read and I can't remember who it was or where it was, but I know it was really, really useful. You can actually search through it. So instead of going back to, say, your database searching, if you know you've read it and you've saved it, you can actually search in your own, it's kind of like your own personal database, and it would help you find about it. And you can also directly import from a website. So if you have, if you're on the journal page and there's usually export reference and you import it and magically it's formatted. It's fantastic. Previously in ISLD, we've run a session on referencing tools and citations, which was really popular. So if this is something that you're keen on for a future RR-CLaN session, let us know, because if there's plenty of interest, this might be something we'd be happy to look at as well. So pop that in the chat. I did see that someone's mentioned Zotero. I haven't personally used Zotero, but I had a colleague who really loved it. So I think kind of 50-50 sort of thing. And there would be more as well. They're just ones that I don't particularly know about. Yeah, I think everyone's really, really keen. Okay, cool. Alex, we might schedule this for later in the year and do a referencing and citation one.
Sounds like it would be worthwhile, yeah.
All right, beautiful. Now, you found your references, you put them in Mendeley or EndNote or Zotero or something, but writing, that's the hard thing. You got it all in here, you know what you want to say, but from here to your screen, it's the longest distance in the history of mankind. So how do you get started? I want to start up by saying that there's no one way to do it. You've got to do what works for you. I kind of do it a bit haphazardly. I like to have my references. I look at a paper and I've got it there that I might write a sentence here and a sentence here because I know roughly the kind of structure I want to have because I'm telling a story. It's always about telling a story. And I sort of put it together. It's almost like a jigsaw puzzle. Other people like to do it, for instance, chronologically or thematically, and they'll do everything on a theme and write that section. Doesn't matter. 6 of one, half a dozen the other. Really doesn't matter. I would say as you go, though, do take your notes, look for those common themes. That will help you build in your mind the picture of what you want to tell. If you're writing a literature review or actually writing any manuscript, you're telling a story. It needs to have a flow. You can't just have a whole bunch of paragraphs about certain topics that might be great without any sort of segue or link between them. You got a theme, and there's got to be something that runs all the way through. Some people they're really visual, they get out the butcher's paper, they do maps, tables, they do a matrix of things. It just depends how you work. Again, when you're writing this, you're thinking about also not just what is known, but also the gaps in the literature, what is not known. There's no point really in going and just repeating something that's already been done and is well known just for the sake of it. I mean, there's not always a great benefit in that. What is not known? How can the work that you're doing plug those gaps in the literature? And again, set yourself some boundaries because otherwise it's going to get out of hand if you don't set yourself some boundaries. You could going to write forever if you let yourself go. So give yourself a scope and stick within that. So a few key steps that you might want to think about in a nutshell. You're going to search. We've looked at some tools to help you search. But you've then got to filter it. You need to evaluate. Okay, this isn't the lower level skills of just chuck everything in and hope for the best. You've got to actually evaluate and synthesize. Identify those references that are going to be the most useful. Identify the gaps in the literature. Identify the key points that people think really is worth pursuing. Identify the key things that are known. That should help frame your research project. Create yourself an outline. Don't just start writing and again hope for the best because you'll be staring at a blank screen for a long time. Give yourself a rough idea. Think, okay, I've known these things. I've identified the key themes. I've identified what's known. I've identified the gaps, which generally should lead to the aims of your project. Create yourself a rough outline. And then, it sounds really simple, but just write. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be like a beautiful prose that you start from the beginning to the end. It's going to be all messy and you're going to write a bit here and then write a bit down the end. And then you're going to think of something and go, oh, I know where that should fit. It's going to be messy, but in the end, it will actually get there if you've given yourself a good outline. Now, I make it sound easy, I know. It does take practice. Writing well is actually a difficult skill, but you're never going to get better if you don't start. And what I would really suggest as well, especially if you're new to research and you're really learning these skills, have a mentor, someone who can review what you've done at regular intervals. Don't isolate yourself. And I've seen PhD students do this. I've got a student at the moment who hasn't been giving us her manuscript, and I finally got it. Honestly, it was a mess, and I had to do a lot with it. Give someone that, if you're learning, give someone a look at what you're doing, and maybe they'll pull it apart, but that's okay. That's the way that we learn. I've been pulled apart when I was learning as well, and I think all our experienced researchers who are on the line today as well have probably been through the same thing. So make sure you have a mentor as well to look and read at what you've done. I've said this a few times. I'm going to keep emphasizing it. What is the story that you're trying to tell? That will help you frame your scope and what you're going to actually write. Now, of course, you can arrange it in a whole lot of different areas, chronologically, thematically. It really doesn't matter. Maybe there might be a reason for choosing one over the other, depending on the topic area or your clinical field. It's up to you. What I like to advise people to do is start really broad. For me, that's often why I go to those national figures, and I might talk about, for instance, the national incidence of this particular disease state, whatever it is. Start really broad, bring in the focus. Personally, I find that really helpful. That mightn't work for you. You'll find your own thing. Again, I'm going to write an unpopular opinion. It sometimes is okay to write something you know to be true and find the references later. I know that sounds super, super dodgy, but again, remember, you guys are experts in your field. You might have read something and you go, oh man, people have written this a few times. Yeah, I've heard this come up. And because of what you're writing in the flow, it's the right point to put something in, but you can't find the actual paper. Don't get bogged down by that. Just write the thing that you know to be true, and then you'll usually be able to fit in the references later. Obviously, don't go write something just because you think it sounds good. If you know it to be true, then you can, I guess what I'm saying is don't get stuck trying to find those references. Otherwise, you can get bogged down. And also do remember what your research question is. It's very easy to get really enthusiastic about what you're doing and kind of get dragged into some other area. Everything you're writing should be leading to your aims. Remember, start big, focus it in, start with what is known, what is unknown, and then how does that lead to your study aims? And the other way to do it, if you're not really sure or you haven't done much on it, look at relevant papers in your field, and these should be a really good model to help. Summarize and synthesize. Okay, you're not just retelling the story, reproducing stuff. You've got to use those higher order capabilities, summarizing and synthesizing. Now, you might be at this point and go, I ain't got time for this. Help, what do I do? Well, yes, those initial searches will yield a whole bunch of material. Don't panic. The way of getting through it initially, just read the abstract. Don't sit there and go, oh my gosh, I have to read this entire paper. Nobody's got time for that. Read the abstract, that's why it's there. And after reading the abstract, you might go, oh, actually, no, this isn't relevant. Bin. Or, oh, actually, this is fantastic. I'm going to put that in the I really need to read it later pile. You might want to create some summaries as you go. And where to from there? Well, you might see a few references therein, so references within your reference. There might be a few papers that pop up a few times. I'd follow up on those. And again, if there's a paper that you go, man, this is exactly what I'm looking for, very helpful to look at the references therein. And again, if this is a longer term project, make sure you go and do some of those searches again, just to find some of the latest papers. Okay, we're nearly done. Where to from here? I said this before, a good literature review would help frame your research question and your hypothesis. You don't want to repeat what's been done, and it helps you know what you need to find out. Make sure you're checking the latest literature, because you don't want to get scooped. You don't want to have something start and then realize that someone else has actually just published it. That'd be like the worst thing to happen ever. You can often set up saved searches and that sort of thing. If that's something you're interested in, check your local library and they can give you a hand with it. Again, using previous work to find appropriate methods, and revisit the literature. If you've done your literature search, you've done your project, it's good to go back to the literature and when you're writing your discussion to say, well, does my work support what's known or does it contradict? It's always a good thing to do. And as always, help is available from your local library or your research office as well. So hopefully you're all really excited and you're not completely distressed about doing research. But how can you learn more? Well, funny you should ask, guys. Here's a shameless plug for our next RR-CLaN session number 2. Your research officers will be sending this around. So if you don't have time to snap the QR code, don't stress. We're aiming to run something roughly monthly. So the next one is going to be on REDCap, which if you're into research is quite possibly the best tool ever. I'm a bit of a REDCap proponent now. So I think is it Northern New South Wales? No, who's doing this? Hunter New England. Alex, help me out.
Central Coast
Ah,
LHD.
Three guys couldn't get it right. Thank you. Central Coast is running this for us. So this will come out to you via the comms that you got to help you get to this session. But make sure if you're interested, and it's a great tool for helping you collect data, and especially if you have identifiable data, it's an appropriate and accepted, HREC accepted tool to do that. Now, before you all go, oh, I've had enough, Kimberley, please stop talking at me. I want to see how much you've learned. It's all very well if you've sat here drinking your cup of tea and gone, oh, this is all very interesting. Let's see how much you've actually learned. So I've got another poll that's going to pop up soon. We're going to run through that for a bit of fun, and then make sure you stay on the line because we have a feedback survey. This is our inaugural RR-CLaN session. We want to know what you thought. If you're like, Kimberley talked too much, you can also say that, or you go, it was amazing, you can also say that too. So I'm going to launch a quick poll, and it's got a few questions. And it's going to see how much you've actually learnt from today. And if everyone does terribly, well, clearly I'm not very good at teaching you. So these are all anonymous, so no one will see what you do. So when you're starting your literature review, what's the first step? Actually, I don't know. Here we go. This is my new skills. I don't know if it'll just let everyone go through this because I've got like 8 questions. Can everyone just, I don't know if everyone clicks through
I think
at
it
their own
can
pace.
actually. You can click through at your own pace. So I'm up to question 2.
Oh, good. I'll stop talking. Have my cold tea. Have a go. See how you go, guys. All right, and when you get to the end, there'll be a little submit button, and you should be able to see how you go. This also gives everyone to have a little moment. Oh, can I say question 5, guys? 100% correct. Well done, everyone. I'll leave this going, and then I'll pop the next slide up for those who have finished. We've got a QR code because we'd really appreciate if people would give us a feedback survey because we're just starting this RR-CLaN thing. So let us know. I will leave this here because people are responding, and it's actually really interesting. So I'm going to talk through a few responses, but we've also got that survey as well. So question 1's really interesting about starting your literature review. So some people have said, you know, find articles, planning your study. Think about it. You actually need to identify your question. What are the areas that you're identifying? You can't plan a research study properly if you haven't looked at the literature in your area. So just think about that as well. What it's described as, well, no, it's not a list of relevant articles. That might be how you start getting things, but you've got to evaluate, and it forms that basis for your research as well. And quite a lot of people, about a third of you, have said a literature review is conducted after you've decided upon your research question. It's the other way around. Yeah, you could do that. And I think maybe what people are thinking is they've decided their research topic, but not their research question. The literature review helps you evaluate your research question. Okay, because if you don't know what is known, what is not known, it's really hard to write a good research proposal and research question. Okay, so just think about that in terms of order as well. I think everyone else has done like super well in the other questions. Oh, citation training. I didn't actually call it citation training, but it's usually using a good source to find other articles. So finding those really relevant articles and going, what are the references they're in? That's your citation training. Nothing wrong with it. Very, very useful. Well, I think most people have submitted their responses. So can I just say thank you all for attending and for your attention. Alex, are there any burning questions in the chat that need addressing?
Not that I could find. There was a lot of activity in the chat. I mean, if there are any questions, we do have 10 minutes and people can send through their questions now.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I do want to give a big thank you to Kimberley for the outstanding and very clear presentation, and for you attending. We've had a tremendous turnout. I looked very quickly, and at some point we had over 400 people attending, which is great. As Kimberley said, be on the lookout for next month's session on how to do introduction to REDCap. And then speaking about REDCap, using the QR code on the slide in front of you, or in the chat, I added the link to the evaluation survey, which we're doing through REDCap. So that will be a bit of an experience there.
Yeah.
There are no other questions, which I don't think there are. Probably call the session to a close. Any last words, Kimberley?
I think I've managed to, well, I tried to pin the link to the REDCap. I don't know. I don't know if I did that successfully. Anyway, yeah, Alex popped the link to the survey in the chat, so we'd appreciate
It's
that.
in there. Your QR code works, by the way.
Excellent. I did test them. There's
All
a
right,
couple of people
guys.
with hands up. I don't know if they're intended.
I'm not sure either, and it's very difficult.
I'll allow people with mics. So I don't know if Lisa meant to put hers on. It's a brave new world, all this technology. Maybe pop it in the chat if you want to have a chat. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your feedback. Appreciate it. Yeah, someone said send the slides through. I think I'd be happy to circulate some of the slides. I think that'd be fine. What we might do, Alex, is maybe we should just send this to everyone. Otherwise, if we're distributing it via all the coordinators, that's going to be a bit hard to identify. So maybe just everyone who is registered as attendants, maybe we'll look at sending those out.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I have enabled microphones. So if anyone has any burning questions, please put your hand up and we'll get to you in the order in which you've raised your hand. So we've got Lisa Ferguson with a hand up. Lisa, do you have a question? If not, there is Mathalio has hand up. You have a question? No. Catherine.
Hello. I just had a question about how someone gets into research if, say, they're an undergraduate or if they're not affiliated with a university, because I've really only seen it done in like PhDs or honours projects.
Yeah, I think for undergrads, it depends on the university they're with. So often there are, say, especially in third year or maybe even summer research subjects they can do. So it might be a 6 or 8 credit point subject. If someone as an undergrad is really, really interested, so we're talking pre-honours, I always recommend that that's a good way to go, and probably just talk to the coordinator of their course as a starting point to get that specific information. Otherwise, if someone's working in a clinical area, again, chat to your research office to maybe get some idea of who's doing things. A way of doing it as well is a lot of the medical students or JMOs will often want to do research projects, especially kind of database ones. So if you're working with any particular medical staff who you know are doing a project for their college, you might be able as well to get on to that too. I don't know if that's kind of the short summary. But that would be sort of what I usually recommend for undergrads, is look for those usually third year research specific subjects.
Are there any other questions? I don't think so. Kimberley, you've done an excellent job. It's been very clear. No one's got any questions. Thank you very much.
They're all confused. Who knows?
Oh, they're all confused. We'll draw today's session to a close. Thank you very much for attending the inaugural RR-CLaN Research Education and Training Calendar session, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month for the introduction to REDCap. Thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for attending.